Hey guys, good morning and welcome back to our May 19th video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about President George W. Bush. So let's go ahead and get started. So, Bush and Gore in 2000. Certainly one of the more interesting presidential elections, not only in the course of U.S. history, but certainly in my lifetime. I don't think there will ever be a presidential election quite like the election of 2000. So, to win the presidential election of 2000, Republicans needed a candidate who could unite Republicans while appealing to swing or independent voters. That task fell to the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, son of former President George H.W. Bush. He would face Vice President Al Gore, a strong and seasoned campaigner. Also, the Vice President of current outgoing President Bill Clinton. Gore could point to soaring economy and years of peace as his Democratic achievements. Some thought Bush's chances of beating him seemed slim at first, but as the months passed, Bush's theme of compassionate conservatism attracted voters. His promise of a more caring Republican Party became a central issue of his campaign. So, all eyes on Florida. On election night in 2000, Americans were stunned to see how close the presidential vote was. Gore led Bush in the popular vote by 0.5%. The all-important Electoral College vote came out similarly close. With 270 votes needed to win, Gore had 266 and Bush had 246. Florida's 25 electoral votes would decide the election, but the Florida vote proved too close to call. I will never, ever forget this night. An initial count had Bush ahead by 1,784 votes. The next week, a recount by the machine reduced his lead to just 327 votes. If anyone ever says to you that one vote doesn't matter, the election of 2000 is a perfect example of how very untrue that is. Think about how large the population of the state of Florida is, and it was just 327 votes that are going to make the difference. It's that close. Recounting votes and the hanging chads. First of all, just look at the ballot on this slide. It's very confusing to know who you're actually voting for. And then, again, look at the gentleman trying to recount the ballot, trying to figure out who someone voted for, what their intention was. Some of these voting machines with these hanging chads had never been emptied. So as people would select who they were trying to vote for, the chad a lot of times wouldn't be completely pushed off the paper. And there was this great debate. Is that a vote for candidate X or not? Right? Is that a fully cast ballot? There was a lot of legal argument over this. And it was just in the news constantly, understandably so. I mean, you're talking about who the next president of the United States is going to be. Well, the Florida Supreme Court ruled against President Bush, trying to stop the recount. Now, this issue would end up going all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Well, on December 12th, 2000, the Supreme Court of the United States would make a decision. They voted 5-4 to stop the recount. The majority reasoned that without clear legal standards for evaluating the ballots in question, a hand recount violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This decision gave Florida's 25 electoral votes to President Bush. Just think, only 300 votes. That was it. That was the difference. That's how incredibly close this election was. On January 20th, 2001, George W. Bush took the oath of office and became the 43rd president of the United States. So, naturally, with that election being so close, President Bush oftentimes faced questions of his legitimacy as an executive. Well, those questions of legitimacy would go away in 2004 when he had a dominant showing over candidate John Kerry. So, next slide. The economy turns downward. Under Clinton, we had an amazing surplus. Under Bush, that surplus is going to evaporate quite rapidly. And there's a number of reasons for that. Let's go ahead and get into them. Bush had made cutting taxes a key element of his 2000 campaign. His pledge took on a new urgency because the dot-com bubble began to burst in 2000. To spur an economic recovery, Bush pushed through Congress a plan that cut income tax rates for most Americans. But the economy received a second shock in 2001. Terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon on September 11th, or what would become known as 9/11. Unsure of what happens next, Americans sharply reduced their spending, not so unlike today with the coronavirus. By the end of 2003, the U.S. economy had suffered a loss of more than 2 million jobs. The capital gains tax cut. Bush responded by pushing Congress to reduce tax rates on earnings from savings and investments. Lower tax rates would hopefully encourage people to work harder, save more, and invest in new enterprises. His opponents charged that his tax cuts would mainly enrich the wealthy, which they did. Again, if you're going to cut taxes on investments, that's wonderful. However, people that are not able to invest money won't see any benefit from that, right? So these tax cuts, by and large, did help the people at the top, and the graph bears that out as well. Now, they predicted that cutting tax rates would reduce tax revenues and create a string of budget deficits. So really, in a short amount of time, we're going from an economy that is very prosperous and enjoying a surplus to one that is going to be running massive, massive deficits. The federal budget did fall from a surplus of $128 billion in 2001 to a deficit of $158 billion in 2002. But the shift from surplus to deficit was not entirely due to the recession and tax cuts. The events of 9/11, which we're going to talk about more, also played a major part. In response to the attacks, Bush persuaded Congress to create a new cabinet-level agency, the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, to protect the country from terrorists. He also launched a war on terrorism in Afghanistan and later in Iraq. As spending to fight terrorism soared, so did budget deficits, surpassing $400 billion by just 2004. The housing bubble burst. Certainly, other than the coronavirus and what's going on with our economy right now, the housing bubble burst has to be the worst economic situation I have ever seen. The economic expansion did not last long due to sharp decline in the housing market. For many years, house prices had been increasing rapidly. In fact, from 1985 to 2006, the average sale price of a house rose from $100,000 to $300,000. That is an incredible rate of return, and it was still climbing. A housing bubble had formed, and as we know, all bubbles like to burst. A financial bubble occurs when investors bid up prices to unrealistic levels, often purchasing with borrowed money. In 2006, like I said, this bubble would burst. So, an American nightmare. Owning a home has long been part of the American dream, but for many people, that dream did turn into a nightmare. The government was partly to blame, and so were builders and bankers. Federal policies encouraged people to buy homes. Construction firms built too many of these houses, and banks approved subprime mortgages for people that they quite frankly knew could not pay back this money. A mortgage is a loan that's used to finance the purchase of a house. A subprime mortgage is a loan made to someone who may not be able to repay the loan. Again, the banks want to make these loans because they make money on the interest, but quite frankly, it is negligent to give a loan to a person that you know can't pay it back. so many millions of Americans around our country would face this harsh, harsh reality. So the Great Recession. The housing slump led to a severe economic downturn beginning in December of 2007. Shocked by their homes' falling values, homeowners slowed their spending. With sales decreasing, businesses laid off workers. Rising unemployment cut consumption further. The downturn, the nation's worst since the Great Depression, would become known as the Great Recession. These are very rough years for the United States economy. So an embattled second term. You can see really after 9/11, from the moment 9/11 happened until the end of the Bush presidency, he became more and more and more unpopular. He would end with one of the lowest approval ratings of any modern president at 27%. He became quite unpopular. A reason for such a lack in popularity as well was the Katrina disaster. I remember after Katrina happened, kids from New Orleans coming to school in Florida. They had to move because their homes had been destroyed. I remember it so well. So yeah, the Katrina disaster. Another was the federal government's reaction to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The hurricane devastated New Orleans and other Gulf Coast towns, resulting in a displacement of hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. Yet the response from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, seemed slow and disorganized. Again, Hurricane Katrina was a massive, massive Category 3 hurricane upon impact that just wreaked havoc on New Orleans. Again, New Orleans, a city we have talked about at length this year, much of it does lie below sea level. So you can imagine what a massive hurricane with storm surge might do to a city like that. And here is just some images of Katrina. You can find a million images, and they're all equally sad and devastating. So the lame duck president. A third factor was the war on terrorism. The war on terrorism, along with Katrina, along with 9/11, along with the tax cuts, just devastated our economy. Some Americans believed that the expansive powers given to the Department of Homeland Security undermined their civil liberties. This really goes back directly to a piece of legislation known as the Patriot Act. Probably most importantly, hundreds of Americans were dying each year from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those wars were also sapping the Treasury, adding to the mounting budget deficits. During the 2006 midterm elections, many voters used their ballots to express dissatisfaction with Bush's policies. For the first time since 1994, Democrats won control of the House and the Senate, in essence making him a true lame duck president. As you will learn in the next section, voters would also elect a Democratic president in 2008. All right, so that wraps up our video lecture today on President George W. Bush. Tomorrow we will talk about President Barack Obama. Have a great day.